Welcome to the Zoom Bible study, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. My prayer is that you will be blessed, encouraged, and inspired by it. Tonight is the second lesson in our new Lenten Bible study series titled Wandering Heart, Figuring Out Faith with Peter. The source material and outlines come from sacred art. But with over 4 decades of preaching and teaching, I will also have my own observations to share. Of all the New Testament characters, Peter seems to be the one that most people identify with, mainly because his faith journey often looks like ours. Peter's journey with Jesus, like many of our own, ebbs and flows, zigs and zags. And thus, Peter becomes the perfect companion for our Lenten season. As sacred art writes, Peter's journey is not polished or linear or perfect, but he is always tethered to the love of God. When you look closely at Peter's story, you find Jesus at each step along the way. And I hope that in this study, we also find Jesus at each step along the way in our own journeys. The study is inspired by the classic hymn, "Come, O Fount of Every Blessing." It's a hymn that offers a prayer to, quote, bind my wandering heart to God. And in many ways, the hymn really does fit the Apostle Peter's life. And also, each lesson is titled after a phrase in Come, O Fount of Every Blessing. Last week's lesson was Jesus Sought Me. And in that lesson, we looked at the story of Jesus calling Peter to be his disciple. And according to Luke, there were at least a couple of interactions between Jesus and Peter before Peter left everything behind to follow Jesus. Jesus saw the possibilities in Peter, and Jesus never gave up on him. Just as Jesus sees the possibilities in you and me and never gives up on us. This week, the lesson is titled, Rescue Me from Danger. When we hear that phrase, when it comes to Peter, we can only think of one story, the story of Peter walking on the water towards Jesus in the midst of a great storm. You know, the story is found only in the Gospel of Matthew, and it comes from Matthew 14, 22 and 23. Jesus insisted that the disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side. Having sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, remaining there alone as night fell. Meanwhile, the boat, already 1,000 yards from shore, was being battered by the waves because a fierce wind was against them. At about 3 a.m, Jesus came walking toward them on the lake. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and in their fear, they began to cry out. But immediately, Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter spoke up and said, "Lord, if it is really you, Tell me to come to you on the water. Jesus said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind was, he became frightened. He began to sink and cried out, "Save me." Jesus immediately stretched out his hand and caught Peter. "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat worshiped Jesus. Truly, you are the Son of God. Where does one begin with this story? For a preacher, it's a goldmine of a story. The story of Jesus walking on the water is told in the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and John. Luke leaves out the story completely. And only Matthew tells us anything about Peter's short walk on the water towards Jesus. Now, there are so many different angles in which to approach this story. Is this walking on water something good that Peter did? Or is it a not so good thing that he did? Is it a story of faith, or is it a story of a lack of faith? You know, Jesus allows Peter to come to him walking on the water, which evidently is good, but Jesus never complimented him for doing it, which hints that maybe the story isn't meant to make Peter a hero. The lesson title, though, is Rescue Me from Danger. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Our first lesson tonight is God is present with us in the storms of life. All three gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, and John, all make the point that the storm was already raging when Jesus came to the disciples walking on the water. Now, while literal storms can be scary, and we in North Alabama certainly know the truth of that, it is the metaphoric storms of life that tend to throw us off balance the most. Whether the cause of the storm is our own doing or something that was beyond our control, it matters not to God. God will come to us, and God will be with us, no matter the storm that we face. This episode reminds me of the prayer that Jesus prayed when he was on the cross. In the ultimate storm, in a moment of great despair, when Jesus felt abandoned, Jesus prayed Psalm 22. And the psalm starts out with the question, my God, why have you forsaken me?" But towards the end, the psalmist realizes that God, in fact, had not forsaken him. And in Psalm 22:24, the psalmist concludes, God has not despised, not disdained the suffering of those in pain. Listen to this. God didn't hide, but answered me when I cried for help. And if you don't get anything else from this lesson, get this. God is present with us in the storms of life. Now, back to the story. When the disciples first see Jesus, they all think that he's a ghost. And a careful reading of the accounts of Jesus walking on the water indicate the disciples, when they see a ghost, that's what scares them. the storm doesn't is they think that a ghost is coming towards them. Now, as Jesus comes to them in the storm, he responds to their fear by immediately telling them, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And that term, "it is I," is a variant of the Greek translation of the Hebrew name of God, I am. In essence, Jesus is saying to the disciples, take heart, it is I am. Do not be afraid. Only God has the power to rule over the chaos of the waters, and the chaos of the winds and the waves. Only God has the power to rule over the storms of your life. So when Jesus comes to the disciples and tells them, take heart, it is I, he is telling them that God is on the scene and God is with them. In all three Gospels, that's enough for the disciples. They trust Jesus' statement. They trust his identity. They trust his presence, and their fear vanishes. But in Matthew's account, only 11 of the 12 are good after they hear Jesus' statement. The one outlier is Peter. Peter spoke up and said, "Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come to you on the water." Now, there are only two other times in the Gospel of Matthew where someone says to Jesus, "If you are this, then do that." The devil uses that phrase when he tempted Jesus in the wilderness. If we recall, the devil said, "If you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. If you are the Son of God, jump from the top of this temple." And the other time that it's mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew are with the passerbys at the cross who say to Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." And I don't know if Peter wanted to be on the same list as the devil and the passerbys, but that's where he finds himself thanks to Matthew's version. But the point of this study is that Jesus is the rescuer. And that's lesson 2. Jesus is the rescuer. No matter if Peter is a hero in the story or not, if this is a story about a person who had the courage to take a leap of faith in the midst of a storm and did something none of us have done, but then failed when he took his eyes off of Jesus and began to sink, or if this is a story about a person who should have stayed in the safety of the boat and merely trusted Jesus and his promises. Regardless of what the story is about, and regardless of what approach that one takes towards the story, in the end, Jesus does what Jesus is known to do. As Terence Lester writes, Jesus extends a rescuing hand, and his love is greater than whatever causes us to sink. Folks, that's my Jesus. Now, I can't end this lesson without sharing a story from my seminary days. I was in Dr. Robert Glaze's New Testament survey class, and we were discussing the various ways in which to deal with the differences in the synoptic Gospels and John. He then told us a story about an older student who died while taking one of his final exams. Now, what about that? A professor so difficult that students are known to have died taking his class. Well, since the student died, Dr. Glaze never graded the exam. But months later, the student's widow came to Dr. Glaze and asked him to grade her husband's paper, and then if she could have it to keep. Dr. Glaze was hesitant because he was thinking, what if the student didn't do well on it? I don't want to mark it up badly. But nevertheless, he decided to grant the widow's request. Dr. Glaze, as he was grading it, discovered that the student appeared to have started to have his heart attack while answering this question. In Matthew and Mark's account of Jesus walking on the water, Jesus comes to the disciples, gets in the boat, and calms the storm. In John's account, however, when Jesus got in the boat, they immediately reach shore, and there's no mention of calming of the storm. And the question was, discuss the possible different approaches to the story. And Dr. Glaze told us that as he was reading and grading the paper, the now deceased student wrote to that question, there will always be storms in our lives, storms that batter our boats and frighten us, and storms we have no control of. Then the writing became messy and frantic and began to taper off from what was apparently the heart attack. And Dr. Glaze was finally able to decipher the student's last two sentences of not only of the exam, but also of his life. And here's what the student wrote. Sometimes Jesus calms the storms, and at other times he doesn't. But regardless of whether he does or doesn't, Jesus will always come to us. And he tapers off, and he will get us safely to the other shore. What a story. And no matter what, let's remember the truths of our lesson tonight. God will always come to us in our storms, and God will be with us. And Jesus will always prove to be the one who rescues. As "Come, O fount of every blessing" proclaims, Jesus came to rescue me from danger. Blessed body, precious blood. Peter found those words to be true, and I hope that we will do the same. Until next week, when we continue the Wandering Heart series, God's abundant grace and peace to you.